as someone who's been in the sterile processing industry for a long time, I've made a lot of contacts with a lot of people, have had a lot of employees, a lot of coworkers over the years. And I still to this day continue to get texts or, Facebook Messenger asking me questions, like how does negative pressure work in sterile processing, or how do I run this machine? How does this work? So I just thought one day, I'm like, why don't I just do something about that to help others? And, as I've been on these Facebook group pages and I see a lot of questions, a lot of repetitive questions, I just feel like what else could we be doing to help answer these and to be providing a resource for people to find this information in a much more friendlier, down-to-earth type delivery that isn't this long IFU trying to figure out the basics of how a machine works, for instance.
From the basement to the boardroom. From ideas to innovation, you're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are pushing the sterile processing industry forward. Each week, you'll encounter diverse perspectives from subject matter experts across the country and around the globe. Frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. Now, turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Brandon Huffman, infection preventionist with Peace Health Sacred Heart in Springfield, Oregon. Brandon has over 17 years of sterile processing and operating room experience, both in the U.S. Army and the civilian market. He served 12 years in the military and was dual trained in the U.S. Army as a sterile tech and a scrub tech, and had the privilege to work and learn all over the world, including Texas, Seoul, South Korea, Colorado, Florida, and did a tour in Afghanistan on a forward surgical team supporting special ops. Brandon has been with Peace Health for nearly 6 years, 1 as a scrub tech, 4 as a sterile processing manager, and most recently, infection prevention since January of 2020. And so, Hank, he's got a great deal of experience here, and a lot of that experience is centered around the main topic that we're going to be discussing with him today, which is good and bad experiences with consulting in the sterile processing arena. And one of the things I really love about Brandon's experience that wasn't really read in the bio is that he's also very active in generating content. When I say content, I'm going to use that very broadly and really describe a lot of the things that we do at Beyond Clean. Social media content, presentations, YouTube. We're going to be telling everybody about his project of the Sterile Guy while we speak with him today. But he also has done that career ladder move where he's grown into that role with infection prevention. I know we're not going to talk about that today, but it is something that was a great early topic on the podcast. Maybe I want to say in that first season, the first 15 episodes, we talked about career ladder in multiple different directions, but good for him. And I think it's always encouraging to see that, with good experience and good effort, you can really grow as a sterile processing professional.
That's right, Justin. The number one way to get an interview, and we've said this multiple episodes now throughout the last 10 seasons, but if you want to get an interview on the Beyond Clean podcast, push content, push good content, get active on LinkedIn in particular, and start educating your industry, your coworkers, your peers, and you will get our attention, I promise, especially if you use hashtag sterile processing. But Brandon actually got our attention a couple of years before as I visited his facility as a consultant, and we've kept in touch since then, and it's been great to see him leverage that insight and his skill set in sterile processing to build what he's built today, and I'm excited to talk to him about it.
All right, we'll be right back after a short break with Brandon Huffman.
You're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Brandon Huffman, infection preventionist at Peace Health, and we're going to be talking about sterile processing consulting, Brandon. So thanks for coming on the show.
I appreciate it. Thanks for the invite.
And so Hank always comes up with these really great taglines for the episodes. And he said the good and the bad. And I was wondering why he left out the ugly, but
that's why I'm
Don't
here.
wonder too much. Oh, thank you for claiming that one.
So, because we've had different conversations, and even in this season, we had a conversation around lean, and sometimes it has like a connotation, and even consultants are that way, right? Sometimes, people are threatened by that, and I think this is going to be a really great conversation today to walk through that. So why don't you start with this traditional idea of a consultant versus maybe what you actually see or experience when you engage consultants as an SPD leader?
Yeah, Justin, consulting can be great depending on the department you're in. What I've noticed from my career is any consulting I've seen in the OR or had in the operating room is generally very detailed. They really get into the nitty-gritty of everything that is going on in the OR, what is slowing down the OR. But any consulting I've had in the sterile processing is just very distant, and it's usually dealing with the aftermath. There's these sets of imaginary benchmarks that are created somewhere, these metrics, and it seems like a lot of consultants use these to measure your sterile processing without actually visiting it.
Okay, so imaginary benchmarks, that's a pretty clear statement on where you stand on those benchmarks. But you know what? I think there's a lot of folks out there that probably shouted a hearty amen. And I can't tell you how many requests that we get on a regular basis, folks mailing in to the email address or maybe even reaching out through social media saying, hey, do y'all have a benchmark for X, Y, and Z? And I'm wondering if you could give us a little more specifics on, what you mean when you say that and what that experience was, again, from the consulting side of the equation for why these benchmarks, as a sterile processing leader, why you didn't feel like they were really hitting the nail on the head.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of benchmarks I've seen has either gone off of the number of OR surgical procedures or the OR minutes. What they fail to take into account is all these services and customers that a sterile processing actually services. So operating room is just one customer. It's a large customer, but it's still only one customer. And a sterile processing can serve all your internal and external clinics, your ERs, your respiratories, your ICUs. We do instruments for all these areas. We also can service endoscopy departments. There's some SPDs that still perform cleaning on hospital medical equipment like IV pumps and stuff like that. So to say, quote unquote, one size fits all for benchmarks is just not true in a sterile processing environment. And that's not even getting into the account of the complexity of cases. You can have, just a standard hernia case with a tray or two versus a orthopedic case, which could be up to 23 trays in a revision. And they're just not equal when it comes to measuring benchmarks.
And you know who would know that? And I know this is not the purpose of this interview, right? But I just want to throw it out there. The folks who identify with what you're saying are the consultants who have worked a day in sterile processing. And especially if you have, some real substantial experience in the industry, perhaps you've worked at multiple facilities, multiple size facilities. But there are some things about the complexity of the workflow, as you mentioned, that you just can't really get that grasp of to the nuance. You can learn a lot through books. You can learn a lot through consulting in the field and going into these facilities, but there's some things you will just never learn unless you've been in those facilities and gone through those experiences and seen where those fallouts are, to your point, where the data is not lining up, and then being able to look and say, well, this is why. And I feel like from my experience as a sterile processing consultant, kind of seeing it from that angle as well, a lot of the best ones that I would really entrust my own department with are the ones that have come up through the ranks of sterile processing. And it's not about doing your time as if, you have to do that in order to get that position, but it is about giving that depth of perspective and again aligns reality with, as you said, those imaginary benchmarks that if you try to lay them on top of a department in some kind of cookie cutter fashion, and you shouldn't be surprised on why you end up with a lot of brokenness and and a lot of frustration. So I'm wondering, as we move through this conversation a little bit, if you could give us a couple of examples. Like, we've been talking about benchmarks here, right? But consultants do more than just benchmarking. So what are some of the other experiences or projects or situations where a traditional consulting engagement would address in a sterile processing department?
Generally, what I've seen is efficiency. You know, time is money in the operating room, and we want to get those cases in. We want to turn those cases over. And how can we make sterile processing more efficient to meet that demand? And there's nothing wrong with efficiency. I mean, I love it. We should be good stewards with the time and the work that we are given. But I do think we need to balance that with our quality and our inspection and make sure that the changes we do make actually work in the field. And so those inspections, making sure our instruments are clean, functioning properly, we have to balance efficiency and quality as we make those decisions.
Yeah, and I think sometimes too, and I think this was something that Hank was kind of alluding to, but sometimes it's about the reality of the situation for the department, right? So if you have somebody that's coming in and they're looking at that quality and efficiency balance, but they're looking at it through the lens of maybe a different department structure that they've seen in the past, and they're coming into one that's not the same, you know, it's getting them to be in alignment with literally the structure and the resources that you have available at your facility. Is that right?
I totally agree. And that does seem to be something that isn't always taken into account, because you can have a consultant enter a facility that's, you know, very funded, very pro sterile processing, and, you know, staffing's great and everything's working awesome. But then you can also step into a facility that's been struggling to convince their executives of the need for sterile processing techs and education and equipment. And the level of quality and depth of experience can be completely different.
Yeah, and I can really see where that can be frustrating, right? Because if you can't get that alignment, I think this goes back to something that Hank just said around having some experience in the department, and not like there's, you know, that whole rite of passage that has to happen, but it's that frame of reference. And so the more varied your frames of reference, maybe the quicker you are as a consultant to adapt into the environment with which, you know, you're consulting. But when that's off, those frustrations, I can see that really causing major tension and probably could even sabotage the effectiveness. But do you have some examples of frustrations from leadership and staff around negative consulting experiences that, you know, maybe either you've had or that you've heard other people have experienced?
What I've experienced straight from the get-go is it almost always comes down to staffing at some point. There's always a recommendation, whether it's direct or it's indirect, that staffing is too much and that you don't need as much staffing. And actually, that's your chance to save money. And when you already have a department that's struggling with morale and trying to maintain your quality and just trying to maintain your recruitment, to have positions cut is just demoralizing. And it really sets your SPD back even further than it already is. And to recover from that can be a struggle. So I wanted to clarify back onto the good and the bad with SPD consultants. So what Hank was talking about, that experience, I think it's totally true. So that consultant that has the experience, it's not always about what you know, because we can read books and we can get this great information. But if you haven't applied it in the field and modified it and changed it to fit different scenarios to make it work, then it's hard for you to come into a sterile processing and tell them how to do something when they just know it's not going to work in the way it's being presented.
Yeah, so Brandon, I hate to come back on this because I agree with you on that staffing piece. I feel your pain in that response. In defense of some consultants in the field, I do have to say there do exist some departments in the country that perhaps are overstaffed or improperly staffed according to the volume of the operating room, right? So that is a reality. Now, that being said, your point is still a valid one, because in looking at the low-hanging fruit from a consultant's perspective, you know, that's the easy thing to recommend, right? You go in, you see the labor hours, you can say, hey, you got too many labor hours. But a model that I have found effective and collaborative is put the labor hours on the back burner and say, what else can we change before we start chopping positions on the chopping block, right? Can we change processes? Can we change the schedule, as I mentioned earlier? Can we adjust this? Can we get some other equipment in that can help drive efficiencies? Can we find waste in our supplies, right? Can we optimize our surgical trays? There's a lot of other more complex choices on the table. It is probably why some of those consultants skip over, especially if they don't have the skill sets that we're talking about and the perspectives. They may skip over those harder ones and say it's the people. And sometimes there are, but even when there are, that can be adjusted with all of those other things that I just mentioned and leave that team intact and the morale intact, as you mentioned, but still drive efficiencies and still show savings in departments where it is a matter of budget. All of these departments, if you're not a true revenue generator like the operating room, is a cost center. So at the end of the day, you have to define and defend that. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, some consultants come in not from that collaborative standpoint of trying to save this department, but more from a standpoint of how much can we save out of it with no regard for the people that it impacts.
Yeah, I totally agree, Hank.
So, Hank, the thing that occurred to me as you were talking about all that, too, was like Brandon and I both keyed in on something you said at the very beginning, just about that experience and how important it is. But there are scenarios where there's specialists, too, right? So, somebody who is a specialist in staffing models ought to know how to navigate everything that you just described, or maybe there's other things we should look at. But if they're there strictly for one area, and that could even be lean consulting, right? Somebody who comes in as a consultant with lean experience is going to be consulting on that process. And so there's sort of like this generalized sense of consulting, but I do think that you can have not so much experience in one area as long as you're staying in your lane for the purpose of the reason that you're there to consult. And I think that's another thing that sometimes happens is, and you hear this all the time, project scope, we're drifting from the scope, or creep, you hear project creep. And I think that's where some consultants might be asked to do something by whoever the decision maker was who brought them on board, but it's outside of their realm of expertise. And then it's like, well, were they confident enough, because this is how they get paid. Were they confident enough in saying to that stakeholder or that key decision maker, I'm not really good in that area. You should use so-and-so to help solve this problem. I think that sometimes leads to some of these issues too.
It's funny you mentioned that because I did just do a post on my LinkedIn a week or two ago where we had that same kind of scenario where we had a lean consultant who had tried to help with the space utilization in our operating room storage area. And, they had some really good ideas for, organizing the peel packs and stuff like that. But then they did overstep the bounds with deciding how it was going to hang. So we had this lean consultant who actually put hole punch through the peel pack to hang it. At first, it was quite amusing. I'm really glad it wasn't used on patients, but just to see that the idea and the premise itself was genius to hang them, but the follow through was where it overstepped the bounds a little bit and we kind of left our expertise.
I did see that post.
Yeah, I had no idea that was from a consultant. So this is a great opportunity, guys, to segue from the bad to the good, because there's got to be some upside to consulting visits, right? So Brandon, from your perspective, have you seen consulting done right? And if so, in your opinion, what are the keys to making those relationships work?
I have seen consulting done right a couple times, and I do have to shout out one of them was Hank. So let's just be clear on that. Let's just say it up front. But
he is not paid for this statement.
I was just going to say, this is like a reverse vendor spotlight all of a sudden.
Right. So yeah, a good consulting can be great. And I think it does come back to that knowledge and that experience, but also that humble approach. So I've had you, Hank, where you came in and you had that knowledge and experience, and we were able to work through systems, and you helped me, with the vision of where I saw my sterile processing going, and then the next steps I could take to get there, depending on what I wanted to take on, which was great. But then I've also had another consultant who didn't fully understand sterile processing, who was humble enough to, dig into it, research, ask me questions, and go through the entire department with me and just continually ask questions about how this works and how that works. And that humble approach is a great learning point for them, but also a good teaching point for me to see as I'm working with this consultant, hey, maybe that doesn't make sense now that I have to explain it in such detail to someone. And then it gives you that opportunity to work towards a better solution. And it's not always great to have someone who's always been in this specific area come in. It's good to have that outside eyes with these new and fresh ideas that just make you think, wow, maybe that could work in here. I've never even thought about that before.
That's such an important point about the vision part, understanding the current vision of the leadership in the department or at the facility. Where are they trying to go? And if you look back a couple of years, like what have they spent the last 3 to 5 years trying to accomplish? Because the last thing you want to do as a consultant is come in, one day and upend 5 years of work in progress, toward a direction. And yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I want to encourage consultants who may be listening to this interview or leaders who may have consultants, showing up next week. Be very transparent about that vision piece. Let folks know up front, hey, this is what we have been trying to accomplish. We may not have got it completely figured out, to your point, but this is where we're trying to go. Can you help us get there? In addition to everything else that you're trying to do, can you help us accomplish that? Because it would be a waste of an opportunity to have folks in that have the ear of your administration and not be able to capitalize on that vision. On that point, and this is something I think I hear a lot in the field, I want to get your perspective on, is so many folks, when they bring us in and they get us in their office kind of alone outside of the earshot of administration, they say, Hank, I need you to help me because I've been telling our administrators the same thing for the last, 3-4 years, and they will not listen to me. But if you tell them, they will listen to you. And that positions this question is, how do you as a department leader position yourself as a subject matter expert so that administrators will listen to you and are not as dependent on consultants? Have you found the trick to that? And if so, please share.
I really appreciate that question, Hank, because I believe, and I've always believed, I kind of learned it from my dad, that regardless of what job you're doing, you should be trying to be the subject matter expert with it. It doesn't matter, like when I was young and I worked at a grocery store, I figured out where all the items were so that if anyone asked or if I needed to do a price check, I knew where to find it. I wanted to own my job. So I believe it transfers into any career, but especially sterile processing. It's up to us to know the subject of sterile processing at an expert level. We are the internal consultants to our own executive teams to their decisions, whether they're going to invest capital equipment, whether they're going to expand finances for labor. We need to be able to articulate that to them. And they need to be able to trust that we are the expert in that field. It's important for us, as we position ourselves as that expert, we need to be working the room. And I never came from a position where, I like to schmooze with the leadership and kind of get on that side. But it truly is important to build relationships, not only with your leadership, but your other resources within the hospital. So you have your quality department, you have your infection prevention department. And the more you can get into a relationship with them, invite them in your department, make sure they're up to speed on sterile processing and all the practices and everything that goes along with it, they can expand your expert voice and confirm it as well. So it gives you more leverage within your internal subject matter expert consulting approach.
Excellent. So, the forms of consulting have also changed, right? So consulting doesn't even always have to be, as Hank just kind of asked you there, doesn't always have to be something that you're going outside of the organization for, but it also doesn't have to be something that's very much limited to reports and the sharing of expertise in such a traditional manner. Consulting can also be done in a whole variety of what I'll say mediums or media forms. And you're a shining example of that. So as we talk about media as consulting, can you talk about your current projects that you're working on and the content that you're developing on YouTube?
Absolutely. So as someone who's been in the sterile processing industry for a long time, I've made a lot of contacts with a lot of people. I've had a lot of employees, a lot of coworkers over the years. And I still to this day continue to get texts or, Facebook Messenger asking me questions, like how does negative pressure work in sterile processing? Or how do I run this machine? How does this work? So I just thought one day, I'm like, why don't I just do something about that to help others? And, as I've been on these Facebook group pages and I see a lot of questions, a lot of repetitive questions, I just feel like what else could we be doing to help answer these and to be providing a resource for people to find this information in a much more friendlier, down-to-earth type delivery that isn't this long IFU trying to figure out the basics of how a machine works, for instance.
I just think it's great because what you're saying is you're building a content library and you're not withholding that. So only the people who know you can have access to that information. And I think that's the revolution that we're really in right now. And we're doing this together. Like we see how much you're involved on social media. And that is, I think, something that is what's really helped move this industry forward. Just the access to the information, the access to others, the conversation being prevalent in our industry circles and the ability to access different viewpoints so quickly and so easily. But I'm just going to tell you, I think what you're doing is great. I think creating a content library like that, there's going to be sterile processing leaders, technicians years from now that are still going to be able to access that information, and it's going to make the sterile processing world a better place.
Oh, well, I really appreciate that, Justin. And I do my best to really research my topics just to get that refresher before I do it as well, because you don't want to just go in it off the cuff. So it's actually good for me. There's been times where, I'll forget something. I'll go back and look at my own video just to clarify.
Well, you did all the research, right? And it's one of those things where we can't all have every detail, always 100% memorized. And that goes back to the consulting piece in a lot of ways too. It helps if you're particularly strong in a certain area that you can really make that impact. So I think you did a fantastic job with the interview. I want to encourage you to keep doing the work that you're doing. We'll obviously see you on social media. I really did enjoy the hole punched hanging peel pack post. We all have to have a sense of humor too. And that was Absolutely. Really what helps people, find new energy to be able to keep digging for that passion so that there's always constant improvement going on. So great work you're doing and great job with the interview today.
I appreciate it, Justin.
That was Brandon Huffman, infection preventionist at Peace Health. And we're going to head you in the right direction to see everything that we were just talking to Brandon about. But the YouTube channel, go to youtube.com/thesterileguy. You can also follow him on Instagram at The Sterile Guy. The Facebook group is called the Sterile Processing Collaborative. So you can search for that. And you can always find him on LinkedIn. Just search for Brandon Huffman. He works at Peace Health. Very active. I'm sure if you are following Beyond Clean and our post on LinkedIn and you're not already following Brandon, you'll certainly find him soon enough. And that post from last week, I know this won't air for probably 6 weeks, so it'll be a good 8 weeks since Brandon put up the peel pouch post, but that was entertaining. It's interesting because I felt like at first when we started talking about consultants, heck, I didn't know if we were going to come back from the negative side of things. And then of course he blows up your ego a little bit, he gives you some love. Anyway, I'm just giving you a hard time, but I've known that about you and working with you. And I know that about anybody who is going to mentor. And that's really, I think, the most successful way to approach consulting is you're mentoring. You're saying, if these are your goals, this is how you achieve them.
Yeah, Justin, I invited Brandon on the show because I knew he had some good experiences and some negative experiences as a sterile processing manager. And obviously now he's working in infection prevention, and that could be a whole nother podcast. We've got a lot of folks who want that as their career growth opportunity from sterile processing outward. But, we focus on consulting today, and I really appreciated Brandon's insight. I hadn't heard all of those stories and examples that he told, but that vision piece, the one that I really zeroed in on there at the end as well, that's so key because as a consultant coming in, it's easy to lose track, especially if administrators are asking you to come in and they have a different vision perhaps of what that sterile processing manager does. But if you look at it from that personal perspective, these are folks that have given 2, 3, 5, 10 years of their life to try to improve a department. And we owe it to those folks to ask questions, to understand that vision, and to work collaboratively to put ourselves in the good category of sterile processing consultants and not the bad.
Well said, Hank. That's going to do it for this week's episode. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, or by downloading our smartphone application for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.